Hi, y'all. Welcome to another episode of Stranger Stitches. Let me get the usual housekeeping out of the way. This is not a news story. I have compiled this from a lot of sources, just about anything I could get my eyes or hands on, and this is what I came up with. I went down a rabbit hole so you don't have to. And you can probably tell I'm dying to death of the allergies. And honestly, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to let the AI voice read this because it's getting hard to talk. Um, it is from a script that I wrote and that I compiled. You are getting my original content. However, the AI voice is going to read it. I'm going back to bed to either get over this or die of it. I'll see you at the end. Thanks.
You hear these stories sometimes and they really shake you, you know? Cases where someone does something incredibly violent, goes to prison, but then somehow they're back out in the community and then they do it again. Horrific crimes, it just feels completely wrong. And you immediately think about safety, public safety. And it really makes you ask, how is the justice system actually working? Or, well, maybe not working sometimes when you get past the headlines.
It's definitely a topic that causes a lot of public worry and, yeah, confusion, too. When something truly tragic like that happens, the first reaction is almost always, how? How could this possibly happen? Who decided to let this person out?
Exactly.
And the sources we have here, articles, research summaries, and pretty detailed case files, they give us a bit of a window into the complex realities that actually lead to outcomes like that.
And that's exactly what we want to get into today.
Yeah.
Our whole mission here is to take this pile of information and really unpack it. We want to understand the ways, the mechanisms that allow violent offenders to be released. We want to look at the actual data, what happens afterwards, and explore the bigger systemic challenges that these sources bring up.
Right.
It's about moving past that initial shock, that horror, to try and grasp the underlying picture that this material presents.
We're trying to see what these sources tell us about that really tough balance between, well, holding people accountable, maybe trying rehabilitation, and then, of course, keeping the public safe. It's a deeply complex area, and honestly, the sources offer some surprising and sometimes, yeah, pretty disturbing insights.
Okay, so let's dive in. Let's start by just setting the stage. Based on the material we've got, how do people convicted of violent crimes actually get released from prison? Because it's clearly not always just about serving every single day of a sentence.
That's absolutely right. The sources point to, well, several different routes, different contexts for release. One that comes up quite a bit is parole.
Okay, parole.
Yeah, so that's a discretionary release, right? An offender serves part of their sentence, and then a decision, usually by a parole board, is made to release them under supervision. We definitely see this pathway in a few of the cases detailed right here in our sources.
Like Raymond Eugene Brown, the one convicted of killing 3 family members when he was only 14. He got life sentences initially, but the source says he was paroled in 1973.
Exactly. And Kenneth McDuff, who we'll definitely talk more about, he was paroled back in '65 after doing time for burglary, before his first murders.
Right.
And Arthur Shawcross, too. He was put away in '72 for killing children, and the timeline implies he got out, probably parole or maybe just finished his term, before the killings in the late '80s. So yeah, parole is clearly a big one.
A significant route out. But you said there were others.
Yes, it's common, but not the only way. The sources also highlight release based simply on completion of sentence or legal eligibility.
Meaning they've just done the time. Or they tick some legal box.
Pretty much. They've served the time the sentence required, or they meet some specific legal requirement for release, sometimes regardless of other factors like perceived risk. The case of David Edward Moust is a really stark example here.
The Moust case. Yeah, that one is particularly disturbing in this context. Convicted of involuntary manslaughter in '74, sentenced to 4 years. And the source says he got out in '77 after doing those 4 years.
Right.
But the really crucial part, the documents say he was eligible for release under the law, even though apparently authorities thought he was incredibly dangerous. And even weirder, he actually asked to stay in prison.
It's almost unbelievable, isn't it?
Yeah. So his release wasn't some board deciding he was rehabilitated or ready. It was just the law, the sentence structure.
Exactly. It really underlines how release can sometimes just be dictated by legal rules, not necessarily by an assessment of, current risk or readiness for the community. And then there's another mechanism mentioned in these sources. This one's tied directly to pressures on the system itself.
Okay.
Court orders to reduce overcrowding.
Oh, right. And the Kenneth McDuff case really brings that home, doesn't it? The source specifically says he walked out of prison in 1989. Why? Because of court orders demanding they cut the prison population, overcrowding.
Overcrowding is this huge, ongoing problem in corrections. It strains everything: resources, basic conditions, safety inside. And the McDuff case shows how it can directly, profoundly impact who stays locked up and who gets out.
Hmm?
Sometimes, yeah, even people with histories of really extreme violence.
And didn't the source also frame that 89 McDuff situation as an escape, like facilitated by the overcrowding chaos?
It did. It suggests the conditions were maybe so chaotic or perhaps understaffed that control was just compromised.
Yeah.
He didn't just get released through a normal process. He essentially got out because of the breakdown caused by overcrowding.
So, okay, we've got a whole range of reasons why someone might be released. There's structured processes like parole, there are legal requirements tied to sentences, and then there are these system failures or pressures like overcrowding. And the cases laid out in these documents make it terrifyingly clear that these aren't just abstract ideas. These mechanisms have, in the real world, led to the release of people who then went on to commit more horrific violence.
These aren't hypotheticals.
Yeah.
They're the actual practical ways these individuals ended up back out there. Maybe we should dig into some of these specific cases now, see how these mechanisms played out and the tragic results that followed, according to this material.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's start with Raymond Eugene Brown. His story, just reading the outline here, it's a really disturbing cycle. Violence, prison, release, more violence.
Yes, his case is a grim place to start. Raymond Eugene Brown, born 1946. His first crimes. It's shocking. October 1960. He was just 14 years old.
14. Unbelievable. The sources say he went to the house where his grandmother, great-grandmother, and aunt lived in Alabama. One source suggests the motive was he wanted money for football shoes and just intended a burglary.
That's what one account suggests, yeah. But what actually happened was, well, far beyond a burglary. He murdered 3 members of his own family.
3 people.
His grandmother, who was 63, his great-grandmother, 83, and his aunt, who was 31. The method was stabbing with a knife.
And the descriptions of the violence, they're brutal. We don't need to get into every graphic detail, but the source mentions his aunt had over 100 stab wounds, described as sliced open, throat to pelvis. It was just extreme personal violence.
Brown confessed pretty quickly afterwards. And despite being only 14, they decided to try him as an adult. According to one of our sources, he got 3 life terms in 1960 for those murders.
3 life sentences for a 14-year-old. You'd think, okay, that's the end of his interaction with the prison system, but no. The sources talk about his first release.
That's right. He was paroled in 1973. So he served about 13 years of those life sentences before the parole board decided, okay, release him back into the community.
13 years for 3 incredibly brutal murders. And tragically, that first release, it didn't stick, did it? What happened next?
No, it didn't. He was sent back to prison, also in 1973, as a parole violator. Now, the source clarifies his parole was specifically revoked later, between 1980 and 86, because he assaulted his landlady. The source calls it a rape charge.
So wait, he was back in prison in 73 as a violator, but the rape charge that revoked parole was later.
It seems there might have been an initial violation, and then the more serious assault led to the formal revocation later. The timeline's a bit condensed in the summary, but the point is, his return wasn't just for, missing a meeting. It was for committing another violent crime soon after getting out.
Okay. And then somehow, after being sent back for a violent parole violation, they let him out again.
Yeah, I know, it's hard to follow. The sources indicate he was released from prison again in 1986, and just heartbreakingly, the cycle started over. Only 1 year later, August 1987, he committed more murders.
Oh my God. Who were the victims this time?
This time, it was his live-in girlfriend, Linda Lamonte. She was 32, and her 10-year-old daughter, Sheila. And again, the method was rape and stabbing. It mirrored the extreme violence of his very first crimes back when he was 14.
Horrifying.
The way these murders were discovered, as one source describes it, is just particularly awful.
Yeah.
Linda didn't show up for work, so her boss called her mother, Beverly Evans. Beverly and her husband went to the house. They couldn't get in.
Oh, no.
And then Linda's 6-year-old son, Aaron, Sheila's little brother, he crawled out from under his bed and managed to open the door for them. The source says the little boy then led his grandparents to the scene.
That image, the 6-year-old finding them, it just highlights the utter devastation, doesn't it? Not just the victims, but the ripple effect and the failure of the system. Brown was caught soon after, right? August 87.
Yes, apprehended shortly after. And for these murders, the 1987 ones, Raymond Eugene Brown was sentenced to death in 1988. And this time, the case immediately sparked intense criticism, aimed squarely at the Alabama Board of Pardons and Paroles.
I bet. What did the sources say about the backlash?
Well, his original lawyer, the one from the 1960 trial, he was apparently very outspoken, said Brown should never have been released, said he knew Brown would kill again, and this lawyer claimed he would have told the parole board exactly that if they just bothered to ask him.
Wow. And the prosecutor's office?
The DA's office also complained. They said they weren't even told Brown was living in the area after his parole, which is a huge breakdown in communication, right? Something that could have affected how he was monitored, or at least community awareness. It got serious enough that a grand jury investigation was launched, specifically looking into the parole board's decision-making, their apparent leniency in this case. And there was a newspaper, quote, cited in the source from back then, capturing that raw public anger, basically saying anyone who did what he did at 14 must have something fundamentally wrong and shouldn't ever have been let out.
Understandable reaction. So he got the death sentence for the 87 murders. Did that stick?
Well, it led to a long appeals process. One big argument was about all the pre-trial publicity. Claimed he couldn't get a fair trial. The source mentions that something like 42 out of 66 potential jurors already knew about the crimes, and they cited, I think, 53 newspaper articles as proof of just how much coverage there was.
And did that work?
Temporarily, yes. An appellate court actually overturned his conviction, agreeing the judge hadn't done enough to check for juror bias from all that publicity. But the state appealed that decision, took it higher, and the Supreme Court eventually reversed the reversal. His death sentence was reinstated after more review.
So, after all that,
Raymond Eugene Brown died on death row in 2008. His case, just laid out here in these materials, it's a really chilling example. Violent reoffending, multiple releases, multiple failures, it seems, raises huge questions about parole, risk assessment, communication between agencies, and just the long-term handling of people with these kinds of histories.
yeah, it's definitely a case that fuels public fear and, frankly, skepticism about the system's ability to handle these situations safely. Okay, let's shift gears slightly. Another case that highlights different problems. Arthur Shawcross, the Genesee River killer.
Right. Shawcross's case brings up issues around information management, how history can get sort of buried within the system. He was born in 1945. The sources mention conflicting stories about his childhood.
How so?
Well, he claimed childhood abuse, early sexual stuff. His family apparently disputed all that. But independent school records did confirm things like low IQ, skipping school, bullying, violence, even suspicion for some juvenile crimes like arson and burglary. Point is, he was known to change his story a lot when talking to police or doctors.
So, a troubled past seems clear, but the details are maybe fuzzy, possibly because he himself wasn't a reliable narrator. Dropped out of school early, had some violent run-ins and jail time before his first really major crimes.
Yeah. Then in 1972, he confessed to killing 2 children. He went to prison for those crimes.
Yeah.
And here's a critical detail from the source. His records from that time, they were sealed.
Sealed? Why seal the records of someone convicted of killing children?
The source gives the stated reason. It was supposedly so he could settle into a new town after release without causing, panic or drawing attention because of his past. An attempt at facilitating reintegration, essentially.
Okay. I mean, I can sort of see the logic wanting someone to have a chance to start over without immediate stigma. But the outcome here, according to the sources, was absolutely tragic because after he got out from that 72 imprisonment,
He went on to commit the Genesee River killings
yeah.
between 1988 and 1990.
How many victims?
11 women in upstate New York. Over about a 2-year span, a lot of his victims were prostitutes in the area. He was known to them, used aliases like Mitch or Mike, and the women who knew him described him as, well, prone to violence.
And the details of these murders, like with Brown, the sources describe extreme violence and mutilation, just horrific acts.
Yes. For instance, June Stott, who apparently wasn't involved in prostitution or drugs, she was found on Thanksgiving, strangled, mutilated after death.
Yeah.
Just awful details. Elizabeth Gibson was seen with Mitch right before she disappeared. June Cicero's body found on river ice, also mutilated post-mortem. Source says sawn almost in half. The details are hard, but they show the level of violence.
So the police are investigating, trying to find this Mitch or Mike, and those sealed records, they became a problem.
A significant problem, yeah. Because the police had a description of Mitch, but the sealed records initially stopped them from connecting him to his past convictions for killing children. They couldn't track him down as quickly. His violent history was effectively hidden from their view at first.
Wow. So the very thing meant to help him reintegrate ended up hindering the investigation into his new crimes.
Seems that way. Shawcross was eventually caught. He confessed to most of the murders, but apparently only when the police used some leverage. They threatened to implicate another woman, Clara Neal, because she had jewelry belonging to one of the victims, June Cicero, that Shawcross had given her.
So he confessed to protect someone else, essentially.
That's the implication. His formal confession was incredibly long, almost 80 pages. Very detailed. But true to form, it was also filled with excuses for why he did what he did. He even led them to find two victims they hadn't known about before, Maria Welsh and Darlene Trippi, after he confessed.
And his final outcome?
Arthur Shawcross died in prison. His case really drives home how decisions made inside the system, like sealing records, even if the intention is reintegration, can have these devastating, unforeseen consequences years down the line. It can block investigations, potentially put the public at greater risk when someone with a hidden history of extreme violence gets out and offends again.
It really throws that conflict into sharp relief, doesn't it? The idea of offender privacy versus public safety and the need for law enforcement to have all the relevant information about potentially dangerous people. Okay, let's look at David Edward Moust. His release was controversial, but for reasons that highlight a really different kind of systemic tension.
Yeah, the Mouse case is it's particularly striking because, as the sources state, he asked not to be paroled, he requested to stay in prison, but he was released anyway in 1977. That detail just jumps off the page.
It really does. Someone convicted of killing someone actively asking not to be let out. The sources give a bit of background on him: troubled childhood, molestation, threats from his mother. But he also served in the Army apparently, before his first major crime.
Right. That first crime detail here happened in 1974. He was stationed in Germany. He killed a 13-year-old boy, James McClister, who was the child of American expats living there. Mouse claimed it was an accident connected to his stolen moped.
But he was convicted.
Yes, court-martialed, convicted of involuntary manslaughter and also larceny. Got a sentence of 4 years at Fort Leavenworth.
4 years. Okay, and then comes that 1977 release the sources focus on, even though people were raising alarms.
Major alarms. A fact sheet later sent to Illinois Corrections called him most likely the most dangerous inmate you will house. A prosecutor, from his case, strongly urged them to keep him incarcerated. But, and this is key, the source explicitly states that under the law, Moust was eligible for this early release.
So even with warnings from officials, even with his own plea, a 5-page letter asking not to be released, they let him out, because the law said his time or eligibility was up.
That seems to be the core issue. A Department of Corrections spokeswoman is quoted in the source. She basically said he did not meet the criteria to be placed in any other kind of facility. It implies that once the legal justification for holding him under his sentence ran out, there just wasn't another legal box to put him in, despite everyone's fears, including his own.
And the tragic result, did he reoffend?
He did. The sources confirm it. After that 1977 release, he eventually pleaded guilty to murdering 3 teenagers in Hammond, Indiana. That's according to a 2005 article referenced here. So yes, significant, deadly reoffending after being released against his own stated wishes and official warnings.
The Mouse case just throws this conflict into such sharp relief. Legal eligibility for release based on sentence length or rules versus clear concerns about public safety, even the offender's own assessment of their danger. The system, may be bound by its own laws and available options, feels compelled to release someone seen as highly dangerous because the legal time is up.
It really forces you to think about the maybe rigidity of legal definitions of punishment and release compared to the messy, unpredictable reality of human behavior and risk. Okay, now let's look at Kenneth McDuff. His path to release really highlights the impact of those system capacity problems we mentioned earlier.
Right, Kenneth McDuff, the broomstick killer. His record actually started with property crime, didn't it, before the first murders? Burglaries.
Yeah, that's right. Prior convictions, 12 counts of burglary and attempted burglary. For those, he got 12 concurrent 4-year prison terms. And he was released on parole from those sentences in December 1965.
And then, chillingly, the sources say the very night he got out on parole, he committed his first murders.
The very night, he and an accomplice found a parked car, 2 young men, 1 young woman inside, drove them somewhere remote, shot the 2 men, Robert Brand and Marcus Dunham, then raped the woman, Edna Louise, and strangled her with a broomstick, hence the name.
Just immediate extreme violence upon release. His accomplice turned himself in.
Yeah, Roy Dale Green turned himself in, testified against McDuff, got a later sentence. McDuff himself was sentenced to death for the murder of Robert Brandt.
Okay, so death sentence for that. But again, incredibly, his story with the system wasn't over. He got out again. in 1989.
Yes, and the source is crystal clear about why he got out this time. He walked out of prison specifically because of court orders to reduce overcrowding.
Not parole, not finishing a sentence related to the death penalty being overturned or something. Just the system was too full.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It wasn't a decision about rehabilitation or his sentence changing. It was a direct result of the prison system hitting a crisis point with population numbers and the courts mandating releases to fix it.
That is such a powerful illustration of how those systemic pressures overcrowding can just override everything else, leading to the release of someone who had already shown extreme violence, even someone technically under a death sentence. And after he got out in 89, which the source also framed as an escape because of the chaos, did McDuff kill again?
He did. The sources named victims from this period after his '89 release escape, including Melissa Northrup and Colleen Reed. Though Reed's body was actually never found. McDuff was basically on the run then, fled Texas, used a fake ID, was working as a garbage collector to stay hidden.
How did they catch him eventually?
He was featured on America's Most Wanted. A coworker recognized him from the show and called it in.
Wow. And the outcome for him then?
Sentenced to death. Again.
For these later murders, Northrup and Reed, even without Reed's body, the circumstantial evidence was strong enough. The sources imply he died in prison eventually, given the multiple death sentences and no other outcome mentioned.
Okay, so these 4 cases, Brown, Shawcross, Moust, McDuff, they're all different, unique circumstances. But taken together, they really paint a picture, don't they? They show the different ways people with histories of extreme violence can end up back in the community.
Absolutely.
Issues with parole decisions, like maybe not fully weighing the past or potential risk. Legal constraints where the sentence is just up regardless of danger. The impact of things like sealed records hiding crucial history. And critically, as with McDuff, how system pressures like overcrowding can force releases that might otherwise never happen. And sometimes, as these cases show, with absolutely devastating results when people reoffend. These individual stories are they're sobering. They really show the real-world impact on victims, on families, on whole communities. But okay, what does the bigger picture look like? What does the broader research tell us about these patterns of reoffending, about what actually deters crime, and about the system's ability to manage the risk these individuals pose once they're released? We have that research summary from the University of Tasmania here.
Right. That report digs into homicide recidivism. It starts off by saying, look, defining terms is actually tricky. Homicide, violence, risk, there's no single universal definition. And even people convicted of homicide aren't all the same. They're not one homogeneous group.
Yeah, that's an important caveat. But despite that complexity, the report highlights a key finding from international research. The rate of homicide recidivism, meaning someone convicted of homicide committing another homicide after release, that rate is generally found to be statistically low.
Low? How low?
The studies cited in the report tend to put it around 3%, roughly 3%.
Okay, 3%. That sounds surprisingly low, actually. But is there more to it?
There is. That 3% figure is important context, but the research adds a really crucial nuance. While repeating the specific crime of homicide might be rare, the report mentions a finding that people who have committed a homicide in the past, they were more likely than other offenders, and certainly more likely than people with no criminal record, to commit some kind of lethal violence after release.
Okay. So maybe not another homicide necessarily, but the risk of any lethal violence is higher for that group compared to others. That's a critical distinction.
It is. The report also notes that historically, a lot of research focused more on an offender's criminal background before they committed homicide, rather than trying to predict their risk of reoffending after they get out.
Which brings us to a really key area the research explores. How effective is the length of time someone spends in prison in actually preventing them from committing future crimes? The sources here have findings that kind of challenge what you might assume.
They really do. The Tasmania report, citing specific studies, it says that longer prison terms for homicide offenders were not reliably linked to lower recidivism rates. It didn't seem to systematically change the likelihood of reoffending. It only seemed to maybe impact how often someone reoffended, if they were going to reoffend anyway.
Wait, so keeping someone locked up for, say, 25 years instead of 15 might not actually make them less likely to commit another violent crime once they finally get out?
That's what this research suggests. It's counterintuitive for a lot of people. The report even mentions some Dutch findings that hinted at something almost paradoxical. Maybe people with fewer prior convictions but who get really long sentences might actually have a higher risk of violent recidivism compared to people with longer criminal histories who got shorter sentences. It's
Oh,
complex.
and didn't the older Washington State report summary say something similar about incarceration versus probation?
Yeah, that 93 report summarized earlier studies, and the findings were really mixed. Some studies suggested prison was actually less effective than probation for certain groups like those with maybe 1 to 4 prior convictions. It seemed maybe more effective only for absolute first-time offenders, and some studies found no significant difference at all.
So the idea that just locking people up for longer and longer, or just locking them up, period, is the best or only way to stop them from reoffending. The research in our sources really questions that as a primary strategy. It might not work as a specific deterrent for the individual in the way we often assume.
Exactly. And the Tasmania report points out that many justice systems are primarily set up on a retributive model focused on punishment for the past crime, rather than having a systematic focus on risk management looking towards release.
And didn't it also say something surprising about prison conditions? Like tougher prisons don't necessarily mean less crime afterwards?
Yeah, that was striking. One study mentioned found that harsher prison conditions, or being held in higher security levels, did not lead to lower recidivism. In fact, the chance of getting rearrested soon after release was actually higher for those coming out of higher security facilities, something like 41% rearrest rate.
So, making prison a more miserable experience doesn't necessarily scare the inmate straight, so to speak.
Doesn't seem to, based on that finding. The report suggests that while harsh conditions might maybe deter the general public from wanting to commit crimes, for the people actually in those conditions, it might make reintegrating back into society even harder, potentially, ironically, increasing their risk of reoffending quickly after they get out.
Okay, so if longer sentences and harsher conditions aren't the magic bullet for stopping reoffending by the individual, the research then focuses a lot on risk assessment and management, right? Trying to figure out who is likely to reoffend and how to handle them.
Exactly. But even that is tricky. As the Tasmania report notes, just defining risk is subjective. Experts can look at the same person and disagree on the level of risk.
But there are tools for this. Assessments.
There are. Tools exist. Things like the PCLR for psychopathy, the LSIR, the VRI for violence risk. The report mentions these tools have gotten more sophisticated over time. Newer ones try to look at dynamic factors, things about a person or their situation that can change not just static things like their past criminal record.
Do they work? Are they accurate?
Well, their predictive accuracy varies. It's not perfect. Comparing studies is hard because they use different definitions, different methods. But generally, tools that consider both static and dynamic factors seem to do a bit better.
So predicting risk is hard. What about managing it?
That's really where the focus shifts in the research. Less on just predicting, more on risk management once someone is released.
Yeah.
The report mentions this idea of defensible decision-making.
Defensible decision making. What's that?
It's about making sure the decisions about offenders' release, supervision levels, interventions are really grounded in best practices. Using reliable tools, yes, but also thoroughly collecting and checking information, documenting every decision clearly, making sure agencies are talking to each other, matching the support or treatment to the person's specific risks and needs, keeping regular contact, and crucially, responding quickly and appropriately if risk signs start to escalate.
It sounds like a very thorough, proactive approach.
It's meant to be. And importantly, the report cites a study by Ogloff that found failures in exactly this kind of defensible decision-making were linked to homicides committed by people who had been released.
What kind of failures?
Things like maybe having inexperienced staff trying to manage really manipulative individuals, or using generic programs that didn't actually address the person's specific risk factors, or not having frequent enough contact during supervision, or just poor follow-up when warning signs did appear.
So it's not just about having the assessment tools, it's about the whole system around using them and managing the person afterwards, the human element, the resources.
Absolutely. It's the whole process. Interestingly, the report also mentions a finding that sometimes experienced prison staff people who'd observed an inmate over a long time, their gut predictions about recidivism were actually more accurate than some of the formal clinical risk assessments, which suggests there's real value in that long-term observation and understanding of behavior patterns.
Okay, what about programs? Are there programs in prison or after release that are proven to reduce the risk of violent reoffending, especially homicide?
That's a key question. The research review actually found there aren't many programs specifically designed only for homicide offenders aimed at preventing homicide recidivism.
Really? So nothing tailored for that specific group?
Not that this review identified. There are general programs for violent offenders, things like anger management, alternatives to violence programs. They exist. but the sources say they haven't really been evaluated specifically for whether they stop people from committing homicide again.
What about programs that help with reintegration, like support after release?
Yeah, those reentry programs are discussed. They often combine support inside prison with follow-up in the community. Again, the review found none specifically for homicide offenders, but some do target general high-risk violent offenders. The Boston Reentry Initiative, BRI, is given as an example.
The BRI. What did the findings say about that?
It targeted young men seen as very high risk, often due to gang ties or returning to very violent neighborhoods. It involved work inside prison and then ongoing support and supervision in the community. And the results look promising.
How so?
Participants in the BRI program had significantly lower overall recidivism rates, about 30% lower, compared to a similar group who didn't get the program. And importantly, their rates of being rearrested for violent crimes were also much lower, around 20% compared to almost 35% for the control group, looking at a 2-year follow-up.
Okay, so that suggests these kinds of comprehensive, supportive programs can potentially make a difference, at least for some high-risk groups.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
But the sources also stress what makes them work. You need well-trained staff. The program has to be implemented consistently and properly, and there needs to be really good communication and cooperation between all the different services involved, parole, social services, etc.
And are there downsides or limitations?
Definitely. The positive effects are often short-lived. They tend to fade over time after the intensive support ends. And these programs were found to be pretty much ineffective if the person stays actively involved in gang violence.
What about therapy approaches, like cognitive behavioral therapy?
CBT, yeah. It's mentioned as potentially promising. It basically tries to change the thinking patterns that lead to criminal behavior. But again, lots of caveats. It needs to be tailored to the person. The offender has to actually be willing to engage and change. The program delivering it needs to be high quality. It should target the right risk level and be delivered at the right time.
So the overall picture on programs is there's some potential, but we need more evidence, especially for the most serious offenders.
Pretty much. The reliance tends to be on general violence prevention programs. More specific research and evaluation are really needed to show they work reliably, especially for serious offenders, so that decisions about release based on program completion feel truly defensible in terms of actually reducing risk.
And all these challenges, assessment, programs, management, they don't just exist in theory. They play out in the real world of community supervision every day. That recent Maryland parole officer case that's in the sources, it really brings the human cost and the practical difficulties into sharp focus, doesn't it?
It really does. The murder of Agent Davis Martinez, killed during a required home visit with a registered sex offender, Emmanuel Sewell. It's just a horrific, immediate reminder of the dangers involved in that line of work. The source describes a brutal scene. Agent Martinez found stabbed multiple times.
And the union representing the officers, they're saying this was preventable.
That's their core claim, yes. The union states that serious safety complaints, both about this specific offender Sewell and about broader safety issues in their agency, had been repeatedly ignored for something like 14 months leading up to the tragedy.
What specific complaints did they raise, according to the source?
Well, regarding Sewell, they said previous agents had already documented red flags about his behavior or risk level. But more broadly, they pointed to what they see as critical systemic failures. Like what? Things like not having enough staff to allow officers to conduct potentially dangerous home visits in pairs, which is a standard safety practice. Lack of basic security in the offices where offenders come for check-ins. Problems with equipment body armor that didn't fit right, expired mace. Not enough training, especially on de-escalation or dealing with dangerous situations. Unclear emergency protocols if something does go wrong. And just crushing caseloads, making thorough supervision difficult.
That's a long list of serious concerns. What did the union demand?
Reflecting those issues, they demanded things like allowing virtual check-ins until safety is improved, a full third-party investigation, a review of all safety policies, better equipment and training, more staff, better communication systems, and access to mental health support for the officers dealing with distress and trauma.
And how did the state respond, based on the source?
The state acknowledged the tragedy, expressed condolences, and said they were doing an internal investigation. They talked about reviewing and enhancing policies, looking at equipment. They stated commitment to safety, but also pointed out the inherent difficulty of supervising offenders who were living unsupervised out in the community.
It's just, that case brings it all down to the ground level, doesn't it? Even if you have risk assessments, even if there are programs, the success of keeping the community safe and keeping the officers safe hinges so much on having enough trained people with the right equipment and support and responsive management. And the union's claims here suggest fundamental gaps in those basics.
It brutally illustrates that critical link. The system relies on these frontline components working effectively, and if they're under-resourced or safety concerns aren't addressed, the consequences can be tragic for everyone involved.
Okay, so let's try to pull this all together. We've looked at the ways violent offenders get released parole, finishing sentences, overcrowding pressures. We've looked at these incredibly disturbing individual cases, Brown, Shawcross, Moust, McDuff, showing the horrific reality when things go wrong. And we've dug into the research on recidivism, deterrence, risk assessment programs, and now these very real-world challenges in supervising people once they're out. What does all this mean for you, listening right now? Why should you care about this complex and, frankly, often unpleasant topic?
Well, I think because, as these sources make really clear, the release of people convicted of violent crimes isn't simple. It's not one thing. It happens for a mix of reasons, sometimes planned, like parole, sometimes just because the legal time is up, and sometimes because the system itself is under duress, like with overcrowding, forcing releases.
Yeah. Right. And once someone is released, managing the potential risks they pose to public safety is just incredibly difficult. The research we talked about shows predicting future violence is hard. It shows that simply keeping people locked up longer might not be the deterrent we think it is for that individual. And it shows we need really effective evidence-based programs which aren't always there or proven to work for everyone.
Exactly. And then you add on top of that the huge practical challenges we just discussed. With the Maryland case, having enough well-trained, well-equipped officers with manageable caseloads and institutional support to actually do the job of community supervision safely and effectively. The whole system depends on all these pieces working, and the sources show us, well, that doesn't always happen.
And while the research might say that repeat homicide is statistically low, that maybe 3% figure,
Right.
we have to remember two things. First, as the research also noted, the risk of any lethal violence seems to be higher for this group than others.
Right.
And second, even if it is only 3% or some other low number, the cases of Brown, Shawcross, Moust, McDuff, they hammer home the reality that even a low percentage represents real people, real lives lost, unimaginable pain for families and communities. Every single percentage point is a life that matters.
Absolutely. And these sources really highlight systemic issues that affect everyone. The policies that decide who gets out and when. The fundamental questions about whether our current approach to punishment really achieves safety or rehabilitation goals.
Yeah.
And the absolutely vital need for adequate resources and smart strategies to manage risk when people do return to society.
So this deep dive, drawing just from the material we had in front of us, hopefully gives you a more, informed perspective on all the different facets of this issue. It helps move beyond just the understandable emotion of the headlines to see the underlying legal factors, the practical constraints, the research findings, and the systemic challenges that are all part of this incredibly difficult balancing act society faces.
Yeah, it forces us to grapple with really tough questions, doesn't it? What is the main goal of putting someone in prison? Punishment. Rehabilitation, just keeping them off the streets. How do we get better at assessing risk in people? Are we willing to invest what's needed in programs and supervision that might actually work? And fundamentally, what level of risk is society prepared to accept? Because absolute certainty, absolute safety, that might just not be achievable.
We've definitely covered a lot of tough ground here, looking at the how and why violent offenders get released, the devastating reality check from specific cases, and then the broader view from research and recent events about reoffending, deterrence, risk management, programs, and those critical challenges of supervision out in the community.
Yeah, the core tension really runs through all of it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You have the legal rules and practical realities that lead to releases, sometimes even seemingly illogical ones. And you set that against the data about ongoing risks, even if statistically low for some outcomes, and the clear, significant hurdles the system faces in actually managing those risks effectively once someone is back out there.
So here's something to think about. Given how incredibly hard it is to predict human behavior, especially violence, given the challenges we've seen documented right here in these sources within the justice system itself regarding risk assessment, effective programs, safe community supervision, and given the undeniable catastrophic impact when reoffending does happen, how should we, as a society, collectively weigh those competing goals? justice for past crimes, the possibility of rehabilitation, and the absolute need for public safety. Is total safety from reoffending by everyone released even a realistic goal? And what would we be willing to sacrifice to pursue it? What does our collective response to these kinds of cases and the information in these sources really say about how we understand accountability, maybe redemption, and our shared responsibility for keeping each other safe? Think about that.
Thank you all for watching this here video. Please like and subscribe and follow. Much love from Little Yas to each of you. Content creator making videos on the World Wide Web. Hope I made you laugh and think. Get out of your head. To be live or to enter the chat, that is the question. Thank you to every followers in each nation. Read every comment from the good to the bad. Y'all trolls can catch me outside. How about that? The web said da 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 da. Yeah. Da 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 da.